Before he died, Johnny Carson exposed 9 guests who were gay in secret. For 3 decades, Carson welcomed America into his living room every night, creating an illusion of intimacy with Hollywood's biggest stars. But behind the scenes, as the cameras rolled and millions watched, the legendary Tonight Show host was guarding explosive secrets that could have instantly destroyed the careers of his most famous guests. "Johnny knew everything," said a former Tonight Show producer who worked closely with Carson during the 1970s and 1980s. The stars would appear on the show, charm the audience, discuss their marriages and romances, and Carson would simply smile knowing many of those stories were fabrications. Carson took most of these secrets to his grave. Yet in his final years, he became increasingly candid with his inner circle about the elaborate deceptions he had witnessed in Hollywood, especially regarding the true sexuality of beloved stars who had spent decades living double lives. These actors and actresses carefully hid their authentic selves behind studio-arranged marriages and manufactured public images. Most shocking were Carson's revelations about America's ultimate romantic leading man, the heartthrob, who sat on Carson's couch multiple times discussing his marriage, while living in fear that one question could expose his entire life as a studio-created fiction. There was also the Hollywood golden couple, whose legendary 26-year romance was celebrated as one of cinema's greatest love stories, but which Carson knew was an elaborate arrangement designed to conceal both stars' true identities. These were not casual secrets or gossip, either. Exposure back then meant instant career death, public humiliation, and even possible criminal prosecution on top of that. The weight of conducting interviews against a background of knowledge of the mendacity lying beneath them weighed heavily on Carson's mind as he reflected on his legacy. The most stunning revelation of all involved America's most desirable leading man, a star whose studio-arranged lavender marriage masked decades of fear and secrecy. Rock Hudson, the heartthrob with the fake wife. Rock Hudson embodied male perfection for millions of women in the 1950s and 1960s. Tall, handsome, and charming, he became one of Hollywood's top romantic leads, starring opposite Doris Day in romantic comedies that cemented his image as the ultimate heterosexual fantasy. The irony was extraordinary, recalled a former Tonight Show writer privy to Carson's reflections. Here was Johnny interviewing the man every woman fantasized about, knowing that Hudson's entire public persona was a carefully constructed fiction. Hudson's appearances on The Tonight Show were taut with repression. He and Carson both knew the score, but the dancing around it was careful. As one former NBC executive said, it was an open secret in Hollywood that Hudson was gay, but everyone also knew that exposure would end his career overnight. Hudson's agent, Henry Wilson, had constructed his client's whole life, including a marriage to his own secretary, Phyllis Gates, to quiet rumors. The marriage, from 1955 to 1958, did its job in maintaining Hudson's image. Though Carson never judged the sexuality of anyone, he found such orchestrated deceptions deeply unsettling. Johnny described it as institutionalized deception, said a close friend. He wasn't angry at the people, it was the system that bothered him. Hudson's death in 1985 due to AIDS-related complications devastated Carson, who saw it as the tragic outcome of a Hollywood machine that denied authenticity. Cary Grant, The Secret of Bachelor Hall. Cary Grant defined suave masculinity for generations. With his polished charm and sophistication, he became the quintessential leading man. Yet Carson, who admired Grant's talent, found the disconnect between his public and private lives remarkable. The long domestic arrangement that Grant had with actor Randolph Scott fascinated Carson. Both men shared a beach house in Santa Monica nicknamed Bachelor Hall for more than 10 years while maintaining a domestic partnership that was essentially hidden in plain sight. In interviews, Carson would often feel surreal discussing Grant's 5 marriages when he knew his profound love was for another man. To the public, the two men were bachelor buddies, and their appearances in magazines, things like lounging by the pool or breakfasting in robes, would be instantly recognizable today as a couple. These lavender marriages were crucial to maintaining Grant's carefully constructed heterosexual image. Carson deeply sympathized with the psychological burden of such deceptions. The Cary Grant persona was itself a creation, he once privately wrote. It allowed Archibald Leach to survive in a world that wouldn't accept who he really was. In later years, Carson reportedly expressed regret that his own show and the entertainment industry at large had perpetuated such fictions, forcing stars to live behind masks of their own making. Katharine Hepburn, the 26-year cover-up. Few on-screen Hollywood romances are as mythologized as that of Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. Their 26-year relationship has been cemented as a grand, tragic romance. Yet Carson, who reverenced Hepburn, was convinced otherwise. Those close to him say he viewed the relationship as a symbiotic deal that would keep both stars' private lives safe from scrutiny. For Tracy, it gave cover as a devout Catholic who would not divorce his wife, Carson reportedly said. For Hepburn, it explained why such a desirable woman never married. Hepburn's closest companions were women, including longtime friend Laura Harding and later Phyllis Wilburn, whom she allegedly referred to as her wife. The Hollywood publicity machine, Carson observed, had turned a practical partnership into the century's most enduring romance. Carson admired Hepburn's subtle authenticity, androgynous fashion, independence, and complete refusal to play by the most autocratic of Hollywood's rules. She was one of the few who figured out how to live with dignity despite the constraints, he reflected. For Carson, Hepburn represented a tacit rebellion, a woman who lived partly on her own terms in a world built on illusion. Marlon Brando, the open secret. Marlon Brando changed acting forever with raw performances in A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Godfather. Yet behind his image of uncompromising truth, Carson recognized another carefully managed fiction. Johnny was fascinated by Brando's contradictions, said a former producer. Here was a man praised for authenticity, but concealing so much about his real life. Brando's private relationships with men were well known in Hollywood circles, but not to the public. Carson, who interviewed Brando multiple times, grasped the irony. The man redefining masculinity on screen was defeating it in private. The rumored relationships Brando had with fellow actor James Dean most intrigued Carson. He was fascinated that the two men who symbolized the new American male ideal were both allegedly living lives that challenged that ideal, explained an NBC colleague. For Carson, these revelations of Hudson, Grant, Hepburn, Brando, and others were not about gossip but truth. They reflected a painful reality of Hollywood's golden age, that the brightest stars often lived in the shadows, forced to hide who they really were to protect the careers that made them icons. James Dean, the paid-for career. James Dean appeared in just 3 major films before his tragic death in a car crash at age 24. Yet his performances in East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant made him an enduring cultural icon, the quintessential troubled youth whose intensity and emotional vulnerability spoke to an entire generation seeking authenticity in a conformist era. Those close to Johnny Carson, however, say the host was more troubled by what he knew or had heard about Dean's path to stardom. While Carson never interviewed Dean, the actor died before Carson took over The Tonight Show. He heard countless stories from Hollywood insiders. What disturbed Johnny were the persistent allegations that Dean had engaged in relationships with powerful men to advance his career, says a former staffer who heard Carson's private reflections on the matter. Rumors of Dean's pragmatic bisexuality, using relationships with influential industry figures to secure roles and opportunities, flowed freely in Hollywood during his lifetime and well after. Johnny would discuss how the public saw Dean as the ultimate rebel, authentic, uncompromising, true to himself, when actually behind the myth were stories of strategic compromise, said a writer who worked with Carson. Among the most persistent rumors were those involving influential director Rogers Brackett, who helped launch Dean's career, and other powerful men in Hollywood who could open doors for ambitious young actors. Carson, however, was careful not to judge Dean. He saw it as an indictment of the system, not the person, said a friend of the late-night host. It was a world where talented young people were often forced to commodify themselves to survive. What interested Carson even more, however, was how Dean's early death transformed these potentially damaging stories into part of his legend. Because he died so young, Dean was never subjected to the scrutiny that might have exposed uncomfortable truths. Death protected his myth, Carson reportedly said. It froze him at a moment of promise before real life could complicate the story. Dean's image as the eternal rebel tragic, beautiful, mysterious became one of Hollywood's most successful examples of myth overpowering reality. Marlene Dietrich, the ultimate androgyne. Marlene Dietrich imported a sense of European sophistication and sexual ambiguity that fascinated American audiences when she came to Hollywood. From her breakout in The Blue Angel to her collaborations with director Joseph von Sternberg, Dietrich fostered an image of transgressive glamour that few American-born stars had the guts to approach. Carson interviewed Dietrich multiple times and reportedly grew to deeply admire her authenticity. Johnny found her remarkable because she was honest about who she was, at least as honest as the era allowed, said a former Tonight Show producer. Dietrich was known among Hollywood insiders for her fluid sexuality and open relationships with both men and women, all while remaining married to Rudolf Sieber from 1923 until his death in 1976. What impressed Carson was Dietrich's refusal to feel shame. She made her sexual sophistication and European sensibility part of her brand, turning what might have been scandalous into an element of allure. Her tailored suits, low voice, and commanding presence embodied androgyny, turning a potential vulnerability into an electrifying strength. She figured out how to hide in plain sight, said a cultural historian who spoke with Carson. She didn't deny who she was, she stylized it. Her open marriage gave her the perfect cover. Sieber lived with another woman for much of their marriage, while maintaining a lifelong friendship with Dietrich. Johnny often noted the irony, said one of his colleagues. Dietrich could live with more authenticity than most American stars, precisely because she wasn't American. Her European background granted her freedoms that U.S. celebrities were denied. For Carson, Dietrich represented a rare case of someone who managed to live truthfully within Hollywood's confining system, a contrast to those who were forced into lifelong secrecy. Raymond Burr, The Lifelong Lie. Raymond Burr became a beloved television icon through his roles as defense attorney Perry Mason and Detective Robert Ironside. His deep voice and commanding presence made him a household name, and Carson interviewed him numerous times. But behind Burr's calm authority lay an elaborate fiction. What struck Johnny, said a former Tonight Show staff member, was the sheer extent of Burr's fabricated biography. Burr claimed he had been married 3 times, with the first wife and son killed in a wartime plane crash. He spoke about battle wounds, military service, and tragedies that never occurred. Johnny described it as interviewing a character, not a person, recalled a former producer. In fact, Burr lived 35 years with his partner, Robert Benavides, whom he met on the set of Perry Mason in 1960. The two built a quiet life together, running a vineyard and orchid business, while masquerading publicly as business partners. To Carson, it was simply ironic that Burr, who played a man committed to uncovering truth, was forced to live behind an elaborately constructed lie. The psychological burden must have been enormous, said a writer who worked with Carson. He had to remember invented details about wives and children who never existed. After Burr's death in 1993, Benavides inherited his estate, and much of the truth eventually emerged. Yet Carson saw Burr's lifelong deception as a poignant example of the impossible choices faced by gay performers in mid-century America. Some of these products are found in agricultural end-use applications. Physically modified starches, cationic starches, acid-modified starches, and starch esters and ethers. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester, The Double Fake. Charles Laughton created some of cinema's most unforgettable characters in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mutiny on the Bounty, and Witness for the Prosecution. His wife, Elsa Lanchester, attained her own immortality as the iconic Bride of Frankenstein. Their marriage lasted from 1929 until Laughton's death in 1962, seemingly one of Hollywood's most stable unions. But according to those close to Carson, the couple's relationship was one of Hollywood's most successful lavender marriages. Johnny found it fascinating, said a former Tonight Show writer. Here was a couple where both partners were gay, creating a mutually protective cover that allowed them to thrive. Lanchester continued to appear on Carson's show numerous times following Lawton's death. She was respectful to her husband's memory and skillfully dodged any details that might have contradicted the official story of their marriage. Their marriage, as Carson reflected, seemed built on mutual affection and artistic collaboration rather than romance. Unlike many studio-arranged marriages, the marriage between Lawton and Lanchester lasted more than 3 decades and worked as a creative partnership that allowed both performers freedom and cover. They turned survival into art, Carson is quoted as saying. For him, their marriage was an honorable solution to an impossible problem. 2 talented performers in a world that offered them no safe choice. Tyrone Power. The matinee idol's secret escapes the striking good looks of Tyrone Power made him one of 20th Century Fox's biggest stars through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Classically handsome and confident, best known for his swashbuckling roles in The Mark of Zorro and Blood and Sand, and for his dramatic work in Witness for the prosecution, Power embodied the archetype of a romantic leading man. Though Carson never interviewed Power, he died in 1958, before the Tonight Show era. He heard numerous stories from Hollywood veterans about Power's carefully divided life. Johnny was fascinated by how completely Power compartmentalized his world, explained a writer familiar with the host's reflections. By day, he was the perfect heartthrob. By night, he lived the truth he could never admit publicly. Rumors long suggested that Power maintained discreet relationships with men while the studio arranged high-profile romances with women. His marriages to French actress Annabella, Mexican actress Linda Christian, and later Deborah and Minardos, provided the perfect public cover. Johnny saw the tragedy in it, said a friend. These weren't always fake relationships. They often involved real love and real pain. Carson once commented on the irony of how Power's beauty, the very thing that made him a star, would also become his prison house. The more perfect the face, he once mused, the less freedom behind it. Power's untimely death from a heart attack at age 44 brought to an end one of Hollywood's most glamorous and repressed careers. To Carson, he represented the final piece in a long, haunting pattern. Hollywood's most magnetic icons were often those forced to hide the deepest parts of themselves.